Welcome and thank you for joining us today at our second virtual annual conference. Let me start by wishing you all continued health and well-being in these still challenging times. Over the coming days, we have a great program of events. We start today with a town hall session with our ExCo leadership team, and then immediately after this, we have a panel discussion on climate scenario analysis. We will reconvene again tomorrow to discuss some of the key highlights of our global monitoring exercise. On Thursday, we will have an early Basel time panel discussion on the pandemic protection gap. And then on the same afternoon, you can join a panel on governance and ethics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. More details about all this program can be found on the annual conference section of our website, where all the panels are actually still open for registration. And if you cannot attend one of them, don't worry, because we will record them and you can access them and watch them at a later time. I am also very happy to report that we have more than 1,100 registered participants from all over the world, a great turnout that demonstrates that virtual events have also some benefits. We are also very pleased to say that with this year's annual conference, we have been able to increase engagement by offering more opportunities for you to ask questions. And we will also be taking the mood of the virtual room with a few polls that will take place in the panel sessions. Before we move on to today's business, I would like to remind you of some of the housekeeping rules. First of all, to maintain a good audio quality, all participants will be put in listen-only mode. However, we would like to encourage you for an active participation and to contribute by asking questions using the Q&A function. If you experience any technical issues during the annual conference, please send a message via the WebEx chat to the host and we will respond to your message. Lastly, this event, as I said, will be recorded and shared on the IAIS website and LinkedIn page in the coming days. So please do let your colleagues know and feel free to look again to the discussions. We will start today at Town Hall with opening updates on the IAIS work over the past year, with a particular focus on the developments on the second half of the year, since we provided our last update at the global seminar in June. We will then move on to an informative session with Klaas Knot, incoming chair of the Financial Stability Board, and then onto a Q&A session where we will dig into some of these issues in more depth. With that, I will now hand over to the chair of the Executive Committee, Vicky Supporta. Vicky, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Romain. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. While conditions are only just starting to normalize as the pandemic becomes more controlled, we have continued to take forward the plan set out in our roadmap, thanks to excellent cooperation and collaboration across our membership. So thank you, members, for that. Our strategic plan has 4 key pillars which guides all our work: risk assessment, finalization and implementation of major reforms, supervisory guidance on emerging and accelerating trends, and implementation support and assessment. My colleagues and I will cover each of these issues in our updates today. So after me, you will have Jonathan, you will hear from Peter on implementation, you will hear from Gary on policy issues, you will hear from Dieter on our Microprudential efforts, and you will hear from Suzette, who is the Vice Chair responsible for emerging markets and development economies. But let me say a few things on some of the key issues that have been occupying me and ExCo over the last 6 months. First, we have, I'm glad to say, that we have continued to make very good progress on implementation of the holistic framework for the assessment and mitigation of systemic risk under Dieter's leadership, which was, of course, a major breakthrough when we agreed it in 2019 in Abu Dhabi. This includes the implementation of the global monitoring exercise, which we call GME, which assesses risks to the insurance sector. While last year we used, if you want, the technology, the machinery of the GME to do a more focused assessment on the impact of COVID-19, this year we completed the first regular, proper, full-on GME covering both year-end 2019 and 2020 data, which was designed to assess the build-up of potential systemic risk in the global insurance sector. The analysis focused on 3 themes: the impact of low-for-long monetary policy in some key markets and a related trend of increased private equity ownership of insurance liabilities, increase in credit risk, and the risk posed by cyber risk. In addition, this year saw a special report on the potential impact of climate change on insurers' investment exposures. We're going to hear about that more soon. All this informational analysis supported a very rich collective discussion by the Microprudential Policy Committee and Executive Committee on the conclusions from the GME analysis in September and what this means for coordinated supervisory responses. We are also making good progress with assessing the implementation of the holistic framework supervisory material. In June, we reported on the baseline implementation across 26 of our members and have since started a targeted jurisdictional assessment of 10 jurisdictions, large jurisdictions with internationally active insurance groups, with more targeted, in-depth verification of supervisory practices. In October, we provided an update to the Financial Stability Board on our activities with regards to the holistic framework. And I'm glad to say the members of the FSB welcomed the good progress on implementation of the framework ahead of the decision next year, which is a key year for this project, on whether to discontinue or re-establish the annual identification of global systemically important insurers, which is a decision for the FSB. We have also made good progress with the insurance capital standard. Earlier this year, we marked an ICS milestone with the completion of the first year of the monitoring period. The first year of ICS monitoring saw strong participation and engagement from insurance groups around the world. We are grateful for this continued cooperation, which is essential for both the development of the project, but also to be able to recognize the products and the specific circumstances of IAGs around the world. I'm pleased to say that despite the pandemic, the ICS remains firmly on track with no planned changes to the monitoring period timelines and good engagement with those firms taking part as volunteers who through their participation have the opportunity to help shape this international standard. With additional insurance groups now participating in the monitoring period, we look forward to getting even more and varied input during the remainder of the monitoring period, and which will allow us to take into account these firms' specific circumstances. Importantly, this year, we also had the first ICS discussions amongst group-wide supervisors in supervisory colleges, which provided valuable input and feedback to further enhance the ICS. Work also continues on developing the criteria that will be used to assess whether the aggregation method being developed by the US and other interested jurisdictions provides comparable outcomes to the ICS. More detailed criteria will be developed for each high-level principle that we agreed earlier this year. This work began later than originally intended due to the operational changes in order to provide relief to firms and supervisors we did last year. Due to the delayed start date, the planned public consultation on the draft comparability criteria will now take place in the first half of next year. However, I need to stress that this change will not alter the overall timeline of the comparability assessment project, which is an important pillar of our overall Abu Dhabi agreement, which will conclude as planned in 2024. Jonathan and other colleagues will talk about our work on supervisory responses to accelerating trends and implementation. But I would like to flag a statement that we're going to put out shortly on our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In this statement, we emphasize the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations for the objectives of insurance supervision and the IAIS mission of policyholder protection and contribution to financial stability. It's through essentially enhancing robustness in decision-making processes. This statement is a modest yet very important first step in this incredibly important journey of supporting our members and the industry in integrating the broad range of benefits that a focus on inclusion, diversity, and equity can bring. Jonathan will say a bit more on this too. With that, over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much, Vicky, and thank you for your continued excellent leadership as well. And hello to everyone. As Vicky said, I'd like to say a few words about our work on supervisory practices. When we published our strategic plan, we identified climate change, technological innovation, cyber resilience, conduct and culture, and financial inclusion and sustainable economic development as strategic themes. As Vicky just highlighted, since then we have now agreed to add diversity, equity, and inclusion to that list. And that's because, and it's worth noting that the pandemic has really further highlighted the importance of all of these strategic themes. So starting with climate, and really one of the defining challenges of our day, this year we continued to progress our work both to assess and address risks from climate change. So this includes our application paper on the supervision of climate-related risks in the insurance sector, and most recently our special report as part of the GMAR on the impact of climate change on insurers' investments, which provided the first global quantitative assessment of these risks. We've also recently established a climate risk steering group under the chairmanship of Daniel Wang from the Monetary Authority of Singapore to help lead and coordinate the IAIS's work in this area and to really push on, as we say in our statement, to amplify our efforts in this area. So most immediately, the group will look to take forward work in three areas. Firstly, a gap analysis of our global standards to consider whether changes are needed to more explicitly take account of climate risk or whether further supporting material is needed. Secondly, work to share examples of effective practices for developing climate risk scenario analysis, building on the work of others. And thirdly, consideration of how to integrate climate-related financial risks into the annual data that we collect as part of our annual global monitoring exercise. So a lot of important work ahead on climate. Secondly, on fintech and digital transformation. So clearly this has the potential to radically change the insurance sector, and the pandemic has served really to accelerate these trends that we've been witnessing. As supervisors, we both need to clearly understand these changes, but also understand what is the impact on the sector and what is the impact on supervisory objectives of policyholder protection and financial stability. Whilst fintech needs to be effectively regulated and supervised, we're also aware of the need to make sure that we maximize in a responsible way the benefits of digital transformation for financial inclusion and addressing the protection gap. So that's why I'm very happy to see the work progressing very well in this area, particularly under our FinTech forum, where I'm happy to announce we have a new FinTech champion to chair our FinTech forum, which is Petra Hilkemar, who you'll know as IOPA chair. Very happy that Petra will be helping to take forward our efforts in this area. And next year we will receive deep dive reports on key trends. We'll also finalize a report based on an IAIS member survey of supervisory approaches to digital transformation and explore supervisory challenges experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic that have accelerated an interest in and a demand for supervisory technology or SupTech solutions. Next, on cyber. So here our Operational Resilience Task Force is looking at further guidance on cyber resilience, and Gary will cover this later in his report. On cyber risk underwriting, this I'm happy to announce will form a special topic of next year's Global Insurance Market Report, or GMAR, which will build on the 2019 report from our cyber underwriting small group, and look at these issues also from a financial stability perspective. On conduct, we will continue our focus on consumer outcomes, next year completing work on key indicators of market conduct risk. On financial inclusion and sustainable development, this remains a very important topic for the IAIS, particularly in light of our broad membership. So in addition to the work that we've been doing to date with the A2II on protection gaps around climate change, we're also progressing work with them on the pandemic risk protection gap, starting with a stock take of initiatives underway in various regions, really together with key supervisory considerations with respect to those initiatives. And we look forward to hearing more about this on a panel discussion in the annual conference on Thursday. And we really think the IAIS is in a unique position to draw comparisons and identify key issues for supervisors to consider in this area. Next, on to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as Vicky has already mentioned, we very much look forward to including this theme in our work. So next year we will start considering interlinkages between DE&I and our work on governance, culture, and conduct. We'll undertake a stock take of initiatives in place both within the sector and amongst supervisors in support of DE&I objectives, particularly, I think, in recognition of the benefits of advancing DE&I from a prudential, conduct, and sustainability perspective. And we've already had some very good engagement with stakeholders, including GIFIA, Geneva Association, on this topic, and we certainly plan further stakeholder engagement as we take this work forward next year. And then finally, to conclude, just to talk a little bit about our work on implementation. By way of an intro to Peter's speech, but we continue to be very grateful for the work of our implementation partners, including, of course, the Access to Insurance Initiative, but also the FSI and the Toronto Centre, as they support our members to implement our standards, including training, peer exchange, and implementation assessment exercises. So with that, that's a brief overview. I will now turn to our parent committee chairs, as well as our third EXCO Vice Chair for Emerging Markets and Developing Economy Issues, Suzette Fuchsang, to go into a little bit more detail on each of these themes. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. As Chair of the Implementation and Assessment Committee, I will refer to key recent activities under each of the 4 pillars of the IAIS implementation strategy. First, the implementation, monitoring and assessment pillar. The IAIS evaluates the insurance core principles, or ICP observance levels, under the CIF's strengthened assessment program. And in June, we published the aggregate report on the peer review process for ICP 19, Conduct of Business, which showed that overall the observance rate for ICP 19 has increased since the 2014 assessment. The majority of participants in the self-assessment scored either observed or largely observed. And furthermore, the member assessment processes for both Mexico and Albania are underway. We have also made strides forward this year in terms of the implementation assessment of the holistic framework supervisory material. The IAIS published the results of its baseline assessment, the BLA, in June, which showed good progress among the 26 jurisdictions which participated. The more intensive targeted jurisdictional assessments of 10 jurisdictions, we can refer to that already, covering all major global insurance markets, with a more in-depth verification of supervisory practices is well underway. And we will deliver a final report to the FSP by the end of 2022. The IAIS promotes effective supervisory cooperation by facilitating information exchange among insurance supervisors through its multilateral Memorandum of Understanding, which is the second pillar of our implementation work. And I'm glad to say we now have 76 signatories, collectively supervising over 76% of global written premiums. Capacity building activities are the third pillar of the IAIS implementation strategy. The pandemic has prompted an accelerated adoption of digital technologies to deliver training, lowering the costs for organizers and participants. With a new COVID-19 webinar series introduced by the A2II, more supervisors than ever benefited from updates from a pool of experts, with 18 events and 1,314 participants from 120 countries. Our forums for sharing supervisory practices in our work on developing supervisory guidance in the form of application papers are the fourth pillar of our implementation work. This year we launched a financial inclusion forum that has discussed issues such as InsurTech through the lens of financial inclusion, and a retirement income and pensions forum that has discussed issues such as pension consumer protection and the impact of low for long interest rates on pension investment strategies. As Jonathan noted earlier, we have also seen fruitful discussions in our FinTech forum. All three of these forums share experience on policy and supervisory related issues, and examples of best practices with their peers. Moving now to application papers. Early in the year, we published an application paper on the supervision of climate-related risks in the insurance sector, developed jointly with the UN-convened Sustainable Insurance Forum, the SIF. And in June, we published an application paper on supervision of control functions. This paper addresses issues related to the supervision of control functions as described in the ICPs and COMFRAME, and highlights that effective control functions help insurers identify and manage risks. And recently, in November, 2 further papers were adopted and published. First, the revised application paper on supervisory colleges, which describes the processes and practices for establishing and managing supervisory colleges for insurance groups with cross-border activities, according to the ICPs and COMFRAME. And second, the revised application paper on combating money laundering and terrorist financing, which reflects the 2019 ICP 22 amendment and various other developments. This, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, completes my report on the IAC activities over the last year. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Gary for an update on the work of the Policy Development Committee. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from here in Boston. Welcome to the Town Hall, and thank you for joining us. The Policy Development Committee is focused on the IAIS's broad policy work. During the last year, PDC and its subcommittees have worked intensively on several pieces of supporting material and continue to make progress on the Insurance Capital Standard. In June, an application paper on resolution powers and planning was finalized, which took on board feedback from the public consultation. The paper provides guidance for supervisors and resolution authorities in implementing a resolution framework, including setting up resolution tools, resolution planning, as well as issues around coordination and cooperation. And looking ahead, in consideration of public consultation comments received on this paper and other developments, the Resolution Working Group is starting to develop an issues paper on the role of policyholder protection schemes in resolution. Just last week, the Executive Committee adopted an issues paper on insurer culture, which is now available on the IAIS website. The paper was drafted jointly by the Market Conduct Working Group and the Governance Working Group and explores the impact of culture on prudential and conduct risks, which is critical in helping supervisors identify and address issues in a more timely and effective manner. As a next step, we'll consider the links between insurer culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DE&I, with the aim of combining work on DE&I with advancing the observations outlined in the issues paper on insurer culture. Addressing operational risk is an increasingly important focus for insurance supervisors and was the reason for the Operational Resilience Task Force, or otherwise known as the ORTF, being launched in late 2020. The ORTF is developing an issues paper on operational resilience with specific focus on IT third-party outsourcing, and as Jonathan noted earlier, insurance sector cyber resilience, and also lessons learned during the pandemic on business continuity management over an extended period. The task force is in the process of reviewing ICPs to consider how they interact with operational resilience concepts. The ORTF is also taking stock of existing publications from other standard-setting bodies on operational resilience, including considering how such publications are relevant to the insurance sector. The ORTF plans to engage with stakeholders on these activities in early 2022 and aims to publish the issues paper for public consultation in mid-2022. Work continues also to consider the treatment of infrastructure and strategic equity as part of the development of the ICS. After collecting information through 2 surveys at the end of last year, the Infrastructure Task Force has engaged with stakeholders and reviewed studies and data to inform views on the prudential treatment of investments in infrastructure and strategic equity. Conclusions from this analysis will result in a recommendation to PDC and ultimately an EXCO decision in March on whether a differentiated capital treatment should be pursued for infrastructure and strategic equity. As Vicky noted earlier, progress continues to be made with the ICS. Despite continued operational challenges presented by COVID-19, the IAIS completed another year of the ICS monitoring period, with the pandemic providing a valuable lens through which to assess the performance of the ICS and evaluate the importance of a global insurance standard in periods of global stress. This year's ICS monitoring period was launched at the end of April with a small number of revisions to address some issues identified through the data analysis and feedback received from the first year of the monitoring period. In June, the IAIS published the updated ICS specifications and confidential reporting package, and we continue to have good engagement with monitoring period volunteers and supervisors who provide useful input to the work to develop the final standard. So with that, I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Dieter Hendricks, Chair of the Macroprudential Committee. Dieter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gary, and also from my side, a warm welcome to everyone joining our town hall today. Now, it shouldn't surprise our audience that the Microprudential Committee has been very busy with implementing the holistic framework. As such, and as already mentioned by Vicky, this year we performed our first regular global monitoring exercise, or GME. The exercise included 2 years of data from both supervisors and individual insurance groups, which of course allowed for a rich analysis and an understanding of the main trends across the global insurance sector. With these data, the IAIS was able to capture key systemic risk developments in insurance groups, such as changes in size, be it due to acquisitions or divestments, changes in asset allocations or investment behavior, changes in derivative holdings, and changes in certain lines of business with a link to the real economy, such as export credit insurance. The GME process includes a feedback loop with group supervisors of participating insurers. It also includes inputs from chief risk officers via a roundtable organized by the IAIS and the GME workshop with participating insurers and supervisors. These are all elements which essentially feed into our GME analysis. The IAIS then holds collective discussions at the level of both Microprudential and the Executive Committee, where a view is formed on the degree of systemic risk in the global insurance sector and, if needed, the appropriate supervisory response to that systemic risk. Finally, at the end of the GME process, the IAIS provides an update to the Financial Stability Board and to the public. As such, I can announce that we will soon publish our Global Insurance Market Report, or GMAR, including our GME findings of this year's exercise. Some insights into the conclusions of the GME will also be presented during our virtual panel discussion, which we will have tomorrow. Zooming in on the collective discussions held in September this year, the Executive Committee of IAIS discussed both individual firm results and trends across the global insurance sector. Particular attention was paid to 3 important risk themes. That is the low interest rate environment and increasing private equity ownership in the life industry, credit risk, and finally cyber risk. We will also discuss some of these themes on the annual conference panel, which I just mentioned. Overall, thus far, both insurers and supervisors seem to recognize the real benefits of this GME, providing a good view on emerging risks in the insurance sector and a true platform to have a collective discussion on the appropriate supervisory response, both at sectoral and individual insurance level. Now, moving to the next topic on climate change. We recently published a special topic Global Insurance Market Report, which was published in September. The report assesses the extent to which insurance sector investments are exposed to climate change. It represents the first global deep dive analysis on insurance investment exposures and supervisors' view on climate-related risks. This report clearly highlighted the benefits of an orderly transition towards climate targets, both from a solvency and a financial stability perspective. Compared to an orderly transition towards internationally agreed climate targets, a disorderly transition or a scenario whereby climate targets are not met at all could have a 2 to 6 times greater adverse effect on the sector-wide solvency of the global insurance sector. We are now, as a next step, committed to deepening both the breadth and the scope of our contributions to helping insurance supervisors mitigate the effects of climate risk. Part of this will imply in the future further integrating the assessment of climate risk into our regular financial stability analysis and our global monitoring exercise. In August, following public consultation, we also published the final version of our application paper on macroprudential supervision. The paper provides guidance on, first of all, developing and applying a macroprudential supervision framework in a proportionate manner. Second of all, on ways that supervisors may tailor requirements of data collection according to jurisdictional circumstances and their own market structure. And third of all, on the practical application of other elements of macroprudential supervision included under our ICP 24, such as stress testing. By helping supervisors strengthen their macroprudential supervision efforts within their own jurisdiction, our supervisory material, as one of the 3 key pillars of the holistic framework, aims to complement global initiatives at the IAIS level, such as the GME at national jurisdictional level. Now, later this week, we will also publish a consultation on liquidity metrics, which we intend to incorporate into our global monitoring exercise. This consultation builds on the outcomes and comments received on the interim public consultation we had earlier. We will consult on 2 approaches that the IAIS has developed to monitor liquidity risk. First of all, the company projection approach, and second of all, the exposure approach used as part of the insurance liquidity ratio. We plan to progress our work on liquidity metrics during 2022 and to finalize the metrics that will eventually be used as ancillary indicators for liquidity risk monitoring as part of the global monitoring exercise. Now, that concludes my update on the work of the Microprudential Committee. I now hand over to Suzette.
Thank you very much, Dieter, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening out of sunny South Africa. Now, more than 90 jurisdictions that are members of the IAIS are emerging markets or developing economies, or as we refer to them as EMDEs. Now, EMDE supervisors, like myself, are keen to integrate cross-cutting topics such as climate change, cyber risk, and digitalization into our supervision. Furthermore, there are ongoing efforts to implement risk-based supervision in the EMDE jurisdictions. Given these particular circumstances, the IAIS holds regular meetings with its EMD members to consider the range of topics they face through the particular lens of these markets. As the IAIS Vice Chair for EMDE issues, I chair these meetings and ensure that issues identified by the EMDE members are raised at the EXCO meeting and also inform the development of the IAIS roadmap. To give you just one example of how we are addressing the needs of EMDEs, we provided an interactive briefing on IFRS 17 to help over 100 EMDE members to consider the steps needed to develop a roadmap for implementation of the insurance accounting standard by their respective insurance sectors. Now, the I2II, the FSI, and the Toronto Centre, which is the IAIS implementation partners, are particularly important as they provide practical support and resources to EMD members in terms of training and information sharing. Now, the I2II activities are key to meeting our strategic goal on peer exchange and capacity building. Its recent work has included the launch of a new e-learning support, a system which will provide EMDE members with access to high-quality training courses in a virtual environment. It is supporting EMDEs to understand the impact of climate risk and has launched a campaign to support members with implementation aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals that relate to insurers. I2II research provides useful insights for supervisors to understand developments on best practice on a range of issues, for instance, It has recently undertaken research on gender issues related to insurance supervision. Additionally, the I2II has provided useful insights into efforts to develop risk-based capital regimes in a proportionate manner, reflecting the more limited resources available to supervisors and EMDE jurisdictions as they develop such regime. The FSI also provides courses for insurance supervisors at different levels, and in 2021-2022, they will provide a total of 6 advanced courses covering a range of issues, including pilot courses explaining the reform package we agreed on in 2019, namely the ICS and holistic framework, as well as the fundamentals for insurer resolution and fintech and climate risk. We also organize regional outreach events that include EMDEs and which provide an opportunity for members to discuss regional developments. During this year, meetings have been organized for the Sub-Saharan African region, the Latin America and Asian Pacific regions, and more than 200 supervisors across nearly 80 authorities was reached during these events, and each exploring particular challenges and topics that are of interest in that region and that regional supervisors. Lastly, an observation from the COVID crisis is that those jurisdictions with risk-based solvency regimes were better able to respond to the challenge of COVID-19. The IAIS is at an early stage of a 2-year project to provide practical guidance to help EMD members to develop their own risk-based solvency regimes, and particularly for the EMDs, as I just said. We see an excellent opportunity here for the IAIS membership to share experiences and advice to support these jurisdictions that want to undertake this change. This provides a snapshot of the activities the IAIS undertook to support its EMD members during the course of this year. And with that, I will now hand back to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzette, and also to all of our committee chairs for that very good update. If you would like to ask any questions related to anything that we've covered in the updates, please do use the Q&A function within WebEx, and we'll get to those later in the call. So we've heard a lot today already about the challenges and opportunities of the trends that are impacting the insurance sector. Last week, Vicky had the opportunity to speak to Klaas Knot, who is the incoming chair of the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, from December, about his views on these trends. So with that, over to the video. Thank you.
Hello, Klaas. It's absolutely terrific to have you with me today in this town hall of the IAIS, and in your role currently as Vice Chair of the FSB, but very soon to be Chair of the FSB. Before I bombard you with questions about the insurance industry, I would like to ask you to say a few words about the FSB. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Vicky. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. I mean, the IAIS community is a community of old friends. It's been a while, but I have participated in the past in a few of your meetings. Unfortunately, I cannot see the audience on the other side, but undoubtedly I would have still managed to get some old acquaintances here. But okay, I am now in my new role as incoming FSB chair, and obviously in that role I attach great importance to engaging with the standard setters in our membership and beyond, and in fact with all the stakeholders. So I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak at this event today. The IAIS has been an FSB member since the very beginning, and its efforts to make insurance supervision more effective have contributed and will continue to contribute to a more resilient and stable financial system. Now, in this context, I am looking forward to discussing issues of joint interest today. Allow me to say a few words on the FSB's immediate priorities. Enhancing financial system resilience lies at the heart of the FSB's mandate. The COVID pandemic underscored the importance of this work, and why we need a resilient financial system, a system that can withstand shocks, particularly those that are unexpected. Core parts of the financial system proved resilient during the pandemic, and this was in large part due to the G20 regulatory reforms enacted through the FSB following the global financial crisis of 2008. Nonetheless, the pandemic also brought to the fore some vulnerabilities that warrant our attention, because if they are left unchecked, they could pose risks to financial stability in the future. The FSB has recently published a report on the lessons learned from the pandemic, which provides more details on this. A major conclusion from this report was that the stress that we observed in key funding markets in March 2020 highlighted the need to further assess and to address vulnerabilities in non-bank financial intermediation, in short, NBFI. The FSB is advancing on a comprehensive work program for NBFI. We recently published a set of policy proposals to enhance the resilience of money market funds. And we will assess and, if needed, address vulnerabilities related to open-ended funds, to margin calls, to bond market liquidity, and cross-border US dollar funding. Beyond the immediate challenges presented by NBFI, we need to make sure that we are prepared for emerging risks that may be building up over time, especially risks that are less understood and harder to quantify. And here we may be able to learn from the insurance sector, which by its very nature has a lot of experience in quantifying complicated risks. Let me point out two of such risks that are of special interest to the FSB going forward: climate-related financial risks and cyber risks. First, on climate. The challenges in this area for the financial sector are significant, they are urgent, and they will most definitely also have a material impact on insurers, on their profits, business models, and potentially their solvency. The FSB has developed a comprehensive roadmap for addressing climate-related financial risks to focus and accelerate the international efforts in this domain. The roadmap brings together and builds on work done by other international organizations and standard-setting bodies. By coordinating all the ongoing efforts, the FSB aims to support a consistent approach among authorities in the coming years. And this should enable the international community, as well as the financial sector, to address the financial risks from climate change in a more effective manner. A core element of this roadmap, especially for 2022, is the development of a global baseline sustainability reporting standard. Mandatory and consistent disclosures are a foundational step for addressing the financial risks from climate change. They will enable market participants, and in fact all stakeholders, to assess, to price, and to manage climate-related financial risks. The second FSB priority that I want to point out is the need to enhance cyber resilience. The pandemic sped up the pace of digitalization in financial services. And this comes with many clear benefits to investors, clients, and financial institutions in terms of efficiency and inclusion. But it also makes the financial system more prone to cyber incidents, some of which could become systemic in nature. If we want to make our financial system more resilient against cyber risks, we need to have a common understanding of cyber incidents and be able to share information more efficiently. The FSB will therefore develop best practices for cyber incident reporting to promote financial stability, which will be underpinned by a common language. Let me make one additional remark before I conclude. Climate change and cyber risks are known challenges, but there are also challenges we do not yet know or do not expect, challenges that lie behind the horizon. The FSB new surveillance framework is designed to scan that horizon for vulnerabilities in a systemic manner. In that spirit, any key conclusions made by the IAIS in its global monitoring exercise are very important input to the FSB work. And this is just another example of how the IAIS clearly supports the FSB's mission and how we can continue to work closely together in the future. So let me stop here for now and give it over back to you, Vicky.
Thanks very much, Klaas. Really, really interesting stuff. So now I'll ask some questions as part of the Fireside chat. And I'll start with the resilience of the insurance sector that we saw during the 20 months that we have all endured of the pandemic. I mean, the IAIS did a global monitoring exercise, which we presented to the FSB, and it concluded that the insurance sector was very much resilient throughout, both financially and operationally. But of course, this was in the context of extraordinary, indeed unprecedented by many measures, of fiscal and monetary support. From a financial stability perspective, what lessons should the insurance sector take from the pandemic?
Well, thank you. I just spoke indeed about this FSB's Lessons Learned report. And one important conclusion from the report was about the contribution that the post-2008 financial reforms have made to a resilient global financial system. The pandemic simply showed that those parts of the global financial system where implementation of these reforms was most advanced, that they also displayed the greatest resilience. And from the FSB perspective, it's therefore important that we continue to push this point and implement the remaining elements of this G20 reform agenda. And this is, of course, a lesson that also extends to the insurance sector. The pandemic reinforced the importance of the holistic framework, which you guys agreed in 2019. And a key component of that holistic framework, in turn, was the global monitoring exercise, which provides the IAIS members with what I believe are invaluable insights into the financial health of the insurance sector during this rather turbulent time, but possibly also into the future. Now, in this context, I think the twofold setup of the IAIS work is highly welcomed. The holistic framework provides for a collective supervisory discussion of potential financial stability concerns related to the insurance sector. And that is based on both an analysis of individual insurers and the potential for them to become of systemic importance, as well as the analysis of trends that are specific for all activities in the insurance sector. After all, we live in an interconnected world, and many of the risk drivers that we sort of observe are not confined to individual insurance companies, but are clearly affecting the insurance sector as a whole. And I believe that this kinds of analysis will also help the insurance world deal with possible future vulnerabilities. We're still living, for instance, in a world of persistently low interest rates. Well, that environment in combination with rising inflation rates, of course, raises challenges for asset liability management. And in particular, if the risk of the value of liabilities increasing more than the value of assets given different durations is rising, then that may then give rise to all kinds of temptations on the asset side to perhaps invest into assets that are a little bit less known traditionally to insurance. And this might incentivize riskier investment strategies and could then lead insurers to broaden their activities into non-traditional lines of business. Now, this is something that needs close monitoring, and I'm convinced that the framework that the IAIS has put in place lends itself very well for this type of monitoring.
Thank you very much, Klaas, and you wouldn't be surprised that I agree. You already spoke about the importance that the FSB assigns to the regulatory community, the financial stability community more broadly, managing the risks from climate change. This is completely shared by the IAIS that has been involved in work in this area for quite some time and is doing more right now. But one question I have for you is how do you think insurance supervisors, or do you think actually insurance supervisors have a role in supporting the transition to net zero?
Absolutely, Vicky. I mean, if I take, for instance, the development of effective and consistent supervisory and regulatory approaches and sort of tools to address climate-related risks, and then I'm talking both at individual firm level and also on the systemic level, I think this is one of the four main areas of focus that the FSB has identified within its roadmap for managing climate-related financial risks. And this also pertains to the insurance sector. I think supervisors and firms face many common challenges here in, for instance, their efforts to gather relevant data and to assess the exposures that they actually carry to climate-related financial risks. And I think by their very nature of their business, their longer-term horizon, I think insurers can be at the forefront of many of these developments. For instance, developing new data analytics to better understand these climate related, both the direct physical as well as the transition risks. So the IAIS efforts to further strengthen focus on actions taken by insurers to address climate-related risks and also support an orderly transition is therefore, I think, important beyond the insurance sector, and it's highly valuable for the broader work of the international community. You have recently published an assessment of climate risks to insurers' assets. Well, that's a kind of blueprint that I think could be followed elsewhere in the financial sector as well. It provides an important insurance supervisory perspective to these international efforts to identify and to address the data gaps and to also analyze financial stability risks. Now, finally, I also believe that an important area where the IAIS work is of particular relevance is the cross-sectoral dimension to this. For instance, the need to consider the impact that protection gaps in insurance may have on other parts of the financial system. That is, I think, extremely relevant not only for the insurance sector, but also for other parts in the financial system.
Thanks very much, Klaas. Turning now to operational resilience and cyber. Again, you mentioned it in your remarks. Big priority, clearly cross-sectoral for the FSB, equally important for us as the IAIS. Can you see any insurance-specific angles that we should be particularly exploring?
Well, here I think that many of the risks that financial institutions face are actually quite well aligned. Of course, we have operational incidents, and at the start of any sort of risk management approach here is to get a better classification and a better collection and gathering of these cyber risks incidents. They do not restrict themselves to geographical borders, to man-made or non-man-made, but also not to specific financial sectors, banks versus insurance versus securities. And secondly, all financial sectors also make a lot of use of outsourcing to third-party service providers. Think about cloud service providers, etc. Those that may be very difficult to substitute at short notice. And these are also risks that I think are affecting the insurance industry to an equal extent than they affect the other sectors. Now, the IAIS has contributed here to the FSB work. I think that is very, very welcome. There is an increase in cyber insurance underwriting and thereby also an increase in operational risk for insurers. And I could only say that the FSB is looking forward to continued collaboration with the IAIS on this work going forward.
Thanks. And a last question, because I'm aware that we are running out of time, is around diversity, equality, and inclusion. This is gaining, shifting up, if you want, on the agenda of a number of regulators and supervisors. Do you think that insurance supervisors and regulators have a role on this agenda?
Again, absolutely, Vicky. And I'm afraid that the time we have left on this call is not enough to deal with the importance of this subject. But let me say that if you really want to have sound risk management and also a sound risk culture within your institution, then it is imperative to have diversity, to have a sort of inclusive culture in which different voices are being heard, in which different strands of opinions are being given the room to be expressed. In fact, we have developed an FSB toolkit on organizational culture, and a key cultural driver of poor risk management and even of misconduct is actually a lack of diversity and inclusion, which may lead to groupthink. That is something that is quite important. It is important enough also to have a clear financial stability angle, and we're also trying ourselves to practice what we preach here at the FSB. For instance, in the revamped financial stability surveillance framework, we have drawn on the collective perspective of our sort of collective FSB membership, but also individual members were coming from quite different cultures and having quite a different perspective. So it's important that we all understand these risks, particularly also in industries that try to service customers, because those industries also need to understand their customers as part of their stakeholders. The needs of their customers will be equally diverse. So that is one more reason why diversity needs to be demonstrated at the very senior level. And I think this is an area where a lot more work needs to be carried forward. But it is a very productive area, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all your time and for putting insurance issues into the broader financial stability agenda. The IAIS is an active member of the Financial Stability Board, and we very much look forward to continuing this relationship that we consider is very important. Thank you so much, Klaas.
Thank you, Vicky, and I could not more than underline your last words. I think this is a mutually productive relationship, and let's hope that once we move out of this digital world, we will be able to catch up on some old friendships also in a face-to-face format again. I would really be looking forward to that.
Me too. Thanks very much, Klaas.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much to Klaas Knot for joining us for our annual conference and sharing what I'm sure you agree with some very interesting insights around the FSB's work, but also very much the relevance of the IAIS's work to the issues that are being discussed at the FSB. I think it's very good really to see the alignment between our agendas and that we continue to work in very close collaboration. So with that, we now move to the Q&A session of today. We're very keen to take your questions. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please use it's actually the chat function within WebEx, and we look forward to getting those questions which you can continue to do over the next while. But we've also received some questions in advance from a number of stakeholders who we'll turn to now. And we'll then turn to those that have come through the chat function. So our first question today is from Dennis Noordhoek, who asks a question from the Geneva Association. Dennis.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jonathan and Vicky, for the opportunity to take part in this town hall today and for the ability to ask questions on behalf of our members. One of my questions is about the process towards the finalization of the ICS technical specifications. I've been talking about extending the timeline of the monitoring period, so I will not bother you with that today, but I do have a question on the upcoming technical specifications and the consultation around that is scheduled for 2023. Now, we feel that the specifications will be finalized in a relatively short time frame. And at the same time, there are still concerns about the current specifications in that risk and stress factors, as well as correlations, to just name a few, are set in a rather conservative manner. As the basis for setting them has not been published, it is difficult for insurers to assess the extent to which they are appropriate. In order to ensure a transparent process and to allow insurers to examine the specifications, we think it is important to disclose a paper that explains how risk and stress factors are set, well in advance of the public consultation on the final draft of the technical specifications, allowing for a constructive dialogue towards finalization. I'm keen to hear IAIS views on the above raised issues, and well, thank you very much in advance for taking time to answer this question.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Vicky, I'll turn to you for with that question.
Thanks, Dennis. Nice to see you, albeit virtually. And thanks for the question. Now, one of the key features of the monitoring period for ICS version 2.0 is to keep it stable. As you know, we have been field testing the ICS since 2013 with a number of changes in the parameters and the specifications. So when we launched the monitoring period at the end of 2019, we explicitly wanted to keep the specifications stable, as much stable as possible, in order to study the behavior of the framework during the 5-year period under the same conditions. Now, that does not mean that we're not going to change the calibrations as we learn from the behavior and the experience. And in order to support any changes, we are collecting supplementary information to enable us to make any such changes and to propose them in the consultation paper that we plan to launch in mid-2023. Also, an important part of the process that both I and Gary set out earlier is the information we collect from supervisors, from the supervisory colleges of the internationally active insurance groups on the ICS, which should include information on how the ratio behaves, the stress parameters, the correlation parameters, including other things. Now, all of that is going to come together in the consultation paper in 2023, which also will include information about how we have arrived at these calibrations and what we have learned during the period before that. But it is quite important to keep stability until we get to that stage in order to carry out the purpose of the monitoring period as was agreed in 2019. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Dennis. I think you have another question for us, which is more on the our GME work.
Yes, thank you, Vicky, for answering my question, and thank you, Jonathan. So the next question concerns the individual insurer monitoring. Now, we understand that the liquidity metrics, once finalized, will be included in the IIM as an additional item. Now, while talking to our members, we noticed that insurers are concerned with the fact that the number of data items for the IIM is increasing every year almost, and this sort of imposes a greater burden on those participating insurers. So we'd like to ask the IAIS to consider deleting a group of items that the IAIS feels to be of a lower priority, or maybe redundant in light of the recently added data items, and not least in light of the development of, for example, the liquidity metrics. So thank you very much for your answer on that.
Great, thanks, Dennis. I think for that one we can turn to Dieter, because I know the MPC and the MMWG have been thinking very much about these issues. So over to you, Dieter.
Indeed, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Dennis, for the question. Which I guess is a question which somehow I felt coming. Let's say first of all, I would like to stress that IAIS is very mindful of the reporting burden associated, let's say, with any data we collect. As I said before, we are not collecting data for the mere pleasure of collecting them. Now, the start of 2021 was in that sense also exceptional. As we were combining a COVID-specific reporting with the regular GME reporting, which increased the overall burden even more than usually, I would say. Now, as part of the GME framework, an annual review of the GME data collections is foreseen, whereby data templates are updated, not only, I would say, to take into account, of course, new and emerging risks, which we should try to capture, but at that stage of the review, important considerations are and will also be given to whether there is indeed room to delete any other data points which are no longer insightful or no longer needed from the perspective of monitoring the key risk and trends of the global insurance sector. Keeping in mind the burden for not only for the participating insurers, but also for the supervisors that participate, as well as also for IAIS themselves, who have to, in the end, validate and analyze all the data. Any new data point, therefore, requires quite a strong motivation and rationale before it's being added to the GME data collection. That's why, for instance, allow me to give you an example here. For cyber risk, we have decided to first undertake exploratory work next year as part of a GMAR special topic, before actually adding new cyber-related data points immediately to the regular GME. Now, allow me also to quickly zoom into the development of the liquidity metrics themselves. First of all, I would like to highlight the importance, of course, of this liquidity work for IAIS, as the liquidity metrics will enable the IAIS to monitor changes in the liquidity risk profile of insurers. As part of the global monitoring exercise, the liquidity metrics will therefore serve as a key auxiliary indicator to monitor the potential buildup of systemic risk in the global insurance sector via the liquidity channel. Indeed, in some recent trends and changes in business models that we have observed, such as an increased shift to alternative investments that may be less liquid in nature, as well as some changes in insurance product offerings, do warrant, according to us, a sound monitoring of the liquidity risk profile. So therefore, at some point, developing liquidity metrics as an auxiliary indicator is for us a key part of the global monitoring exercise. Finally, I would like to make use also of this opportunity to encourage all stakeholders to provide their valuable input on the developments of this liquidity metrics. As I announced earlier today, an IAIS public consultation on this topic is coming up. So I hope, Dennis, that at least answers a large part of your question.
Thank you, Dieter.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Don Fergeron from Jafia. Don, over to you. Good to see you again. I hope you were able to join us.
Can you hear me, Jonathan?
Don, I can hear you. There we go. And now I can see you too.
Good to see you, Jonathan. This is as good as it gets now, is seeing people on camera. So thank you, Jonathan and Vicky and all your colleagues. These are wonderful opportunities for us to get together with the IAIS, and we're most appreciative. I've a couple of questions. The first question, Jonathan, is we want to probe a little bit about systemic risk and proportionality, and something that we've highlighted many times in the past is that conventional insurance business practices contributes very little to systemic risk, and therefore proportionality should always be given due consideration when we're applying the guidelines in each of the IAIS jurisdictions. Our view is that not all insurers have the same exposure to systemic risk, nor do they represent the same potential threat to financial stability. So other than providing supporting material, how will the IAIS ensure that proportionality will be duly taken into account as we go forward?
Great. Thank you very much, Don. And I mean, you touch on a good point, because proportionality is a key principle around the holistic framework. But with that, let me turn to David, who will, I think, take us through a little bit of that from the supervisory side. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Don, for the question. So in the GME, proportionality is taken into account, as is a risk-based framework, whereby any need for supervisory actions at the individual insurer and sector-wide level are discussed based on the nature and scale and complexity of the risks, which are put into the broader financial systemic context. The systemic risk scoring methodology takes into account how much exposure insurers have to certain types of potentially systemic activities, such as complex derivative transactions and things of that nature. Insurers with low exposure to risky activities will not have as high systemic risk scores, and hence will be less prone to debates on any appropriate supervisory actions. Finally, I'd just like to point out that an important component of the GME analysis is the cross-sectoral analysis, whereby the systemic risk scores are put into perspective to the broader financial sector, notably the banking industry. As described in the introduction to the ICPs and ComFrame, the principle of proportionality underlies all of the ICPs and ComFrame material, including those related to the holistic framework. It's important to stress that proportionality goes into two directions, as it allows the supervisor to either increase or decrease the intensity of supervision according to the risk inherent to insurers and the risk posed by insurers to policyholders, the insurance sector, or the financial system as a whole. So as such, for instance, ComFrame itself is an exercise of proportionality in the sense that ComFrame standards are tailored to reflect the nature, scale, and complexity of IAIGs. In some cases, this results in IAIGs needing to meet higher standards than other insurers, where the supervision of those insurers is subject only to the ICPs. The exact scope of the holistic framework related material is also proportionate to the potential systemic risk, with various holistic framework related requirements being tailored based on the nature, scale, and complexity of an insurer's activities that may lead to increased systemic risk exposure. Application papers are indeed developed to give more guidance for supervisors in the application of the IAIS supervisory material, including on practical examples on the proportionality principles as appropriate. This is, for instance, the case in recent papers published on recovery and resolution planning. And the targeted jurisdictional assessment project is deliberately focused on those jurisdictions that supervise the largest insurance groups and they may potentially lead to systemic risk. Within these assessments, attention is given to supervisory practices, including the application of the proportionality principle. So I hope that's helpful, Don, and thanks for the question.
Thanks very much, David. And yeah, I think that's hopefully, Don, that captures very much the emphasis on proportionality. But I understand you have a second question for us as well.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, David. Yes, just very quickly, Jonathan. We understand that the Operational Resilience Task Force has started gathering information about insurers' cyber resilience issues and the supervision of cyber risks, including third-party outsourcing. And of course, we have a keen interest to know how the industry might be able to be involved in this work going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely it'll be the case, but this falls under our Policy Development Committee, so we'll turn to Gary.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And Don, thank you for the question. As Jonathan kind of indicated, the short answer to your question is yes. But to expand just a bit, as I noted a little earlier, the ORTF has undertaken a review of the ICPs to consider which principles are relevant to operational resilience, and has also considered work being undertaken by their standard setting bodies on op risk issues, including A number of them, which a class highlighted earlier, like IAT, third-party outsourcing, cyber resilience, and business continuity planning. And also the ORTF will undertake stakeholder engagement, to your question, on these activities in early 2022. So hopefully that answers the question, and thank you for asking.
Thank you, Don. Thanks. And I understand our next question is from Stuart Wason. Long time no see, Stuart, but good to hear from you. And Stuart's from the International Actuarial Association, and I believe you have a question on the climate side around climate risk analysis, scenario analysis.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's good to hear from you and all your colleagues about the important work of the IAIS. Very much appreciated. And thanks for the opportunity to ask this question on behalf of the International Actuarial Association and its many members from around the globe. So here's our question, kind of a long string of sentences, but here we go. Given the urgent need for a wide variety of and potentially complex climate risk scenarios to inform strategic and supervisory decisions, what is the appropriate role for supervisory guidance? For example, is it to help make the results comparable for different insurers? Is it to foster global development of improved scenario capabilities to better inform decision-making? How will supervisors seek to discourage mere compliance with supervisory requirements and also avoid the tendency for such requirements to foster a sense of collective groupthink? So there you go, a bunch of thoughts there together, but we look forward to your thoughts on this.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Stuart, and we look forward to continuing our discussions with the IAA on these topics as well. I know our climate risk steering group, and particularly the climate scenario analysis workstream under that, are only just beginning to look at this. But for maybe a fuller response, Vicky could add a bit of context.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and nice to see you, Stuart, albeit virtually. So these are very good questions, and to be frank, we are at the early stages of answering them. So if I can take you through a timeline of a conclusion so far and our work going forward. So early this year, we issued the application paper on how to supervise climate risks. That application paper said that climate-related risk, because the material, should be considered for inclusion in insurers' ORSAs, own risk and solvency assessments, including through scenario analysis or stress testing exercises. At the same time, a number of our members are already making pilots or doing separate exercises using almost experimentally scenario analysis to try to assess risks and data gaps and methodological gaps from climate risk. Third, all our membership is very keen to learn from each other on this as they are considering the ORSAs of their firms. So what we have decided to do and what we have started to do through the work stream that Jonathan said of the climate risk steering group is first a stock take of all the practice that we see around the membership. Second, on the basis of this stock take, the Climate Risk Steering Group will recommend to EXCO a set of suggestions on what to do next. And until we know these recommendations, I will not be able to answer to many of your questions. But clearly, what we will be aiming to do here is to support the supervisory community in the most robust and proportionate way to undertake, to help them supervise the scenario analysis that firms should already be undertaking as part of their own risk assessment. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, Stuart.
Maybe, Jonathan, I should add here that I should have mentioned it earlier. In Q2 next year, we are going to be having a roundtable of stakeholders. So in that perspective, all people attending the town hall can participate on seeking feedback from stakeholders on scenario analysis, and this will be an important input on the final recommendations and the next steps on this issue. Thanks.
Very good. Thanks so much, Vicky and Jonathan.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, definitely look forward to that engagement. So now I'm going to move on swiftly to Mary Frances Munro from the IIF. Also great to see you again, Mary Frances, and I know you have a couple of questions for us too.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you very much for holding this town hall and for the opportunity to participate. Vicky and Gary touched on the ICS in their remarks and addressed some aspects of the questions that I have on the ICS, but I do have some additional questions. And following on Dennis's remarks on the technical specifications, which I fully support, I'd like to understand a little bit better what has been the feedback so far from the supervisory college discussions of the ICS, and have those discussions indicated a need for changes to the ICS? And if so, what types of changes are under consideration? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Mary Frances. Vicky, for you.
So on this front, as you said, and as Gary and I updated, we are collecting supplementary targeted information based on the feedback we are getting from supervisors on the ICS. I'm not in a position yet to say what type of changes that may or may not bring forward. And the reason for that is because we haven't yet decided. We're still in the information collection stage. We haven't decided to recommend for consultation, because any decisions will, of course, be up for consultation and stakeholder input. I mean, one area where, as you may know, we are working on is recommendations on whether differential capital treatment should be pursued within the ICS for investments in infrastructure and or strategic equity. And we have a dedicated work stream on this, looking at whether there is a case for changes in the specifications for that particular asset class. And if so, what are the eligibility criteria? We are expecting the infrastructure team to go to PDC this is Gary's committee, chaired by Gary, in February next year with recommendations on that front. And thereafter, PDC will make recommendations to EXCO. In the event that they do recommend changes in that front, we may decide to consult, for example, on eligibility criteria next year, and on a calibration the year after. as part of the ICS consultation expected in mid-2023. I hope that gives you a flavour of what we are doing on this front.
Thank you very much, Vicky.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, Mary Frances. So I'm afraid we do have a challenge now. Unfortunately, we are starting to eat into the time for our next panel. Mary Frances, I know you did have a second question for us, but I would ask if it's okay whether we can circulate that answer in writing to that question, just so that we don't eat in too much into the time for the next panel.
Certainly, and thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Mary Frances. And we did have a couple of questions through the chat box as well. I think one was already covered through the questions, as was another one actually as well. We did have a question around DE&I. We don't have time to go into it, but we will certainly be providing more information in the DE&I statement, which will be coming out, if not today, then in the next day or so. I also wanted to announce, also very happy to share that our DE&I work within the IAIS will be championed by Helen Rowell, who is a new EXCO member who is from the Australian Prudential and Regulatory Authority, APRA. And Helen will be our DE&I champion and helping us take forward that work. So with that, I'm sorry we didn't manage to get to all of the questions today, but as I said, we will publish updates on our work that address each of the issues that were set out in these questions at the time when we publish our newsletter early next month. And do also follow us on LinkedIn to see what we publish next and to keep track of when that newsletter will be coming out. That's the end of today's town hall, but over the coming few days we'll have 4 great panels exploring these issues in greater depth. We'll start the panels with a discussion on climate scenario analysis, so very topical to the questions today, shortly after this meeting, after a short intermission. But before we do that, and really reflecting on this much hoped for return to in-person meetings, we did want to offer an opportunity for a video from our hosts for our 2022 annual conference, fingers crossed, in person in Santiago de Chile. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for all the panelists for the very interesting presentations as well. And let's end off with looking forward to Santiago in 1 year's time. Thank you.